Good morning again. I'm Ed Mierzwinski with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, and along with the Center for Digital Democracy, we are hosting an event to discuss Professor Frank Pasquale's new book, The Black Box Society. Now that the professor has given his opening presentation, we will have a panel of advocates until about 11 o'clock, and then the professor as a respondent to the advocates on the issues that they bring up. And then following that, at 11 o'clock, we're going to have speakers from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Federal Trade Commission, the government agencies that have the most to do with these issues that we're talking about today. So it's a great privilege to bring a couple of consumer advocates who are members of Americans for Financial Reform, an organization that USPIRG is also a member of and that works on a lot of financial reform issues, to speak on issues related to the topics in the Black Box Society. Our first speaker is going to be Sarah Ludwig, a founder and co-director of the New Economy Project, New York City, formerly known as NEDAP, and she's going to talk about an important campaign in New York City recently on eliminating one black box use of financial information, or at least severely narrowing it. And following that, we will have Alexis Goldstein, a former Wall Street technology executive and currently communications director for the Other98.org, talk about a number of the other issues in the book and how they impact consumers. And then, again, we'll allow Frank to be a respondent, make any additional comments, and then we'll take your questions. So without further ado, I'll just turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Ed. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody out there watching. So I'm from an organization called New Economy Project, which is based in New York City. And I was intrigued as Frank was giving his presentation that he was referring to this whole constellation of really sort of dystopian is now attributes of the black box, that, he was using the term new economy. And I just want to clarify that our organization, New Economy Project, has a very different concept of what we mean by the new economy. And that is that we believe that we need a just economy that works for everybody and that's based on principles of solidarity, cooperation, racial and economic justice, ecological sustainability, and so forth. And that until we have a new economy, or unless we have a new economy, we're not going to have an economy that works for everybody, because the current one fundamentally does not. So just want to clarify that the new economy means many things to many people, and we have our own definition, and we imbue the term with a very different vision from the one that Frank writes about and charted out. Ed asked me to come and talk to you today about a recent campaign that we're just sort of happily winding down in New York City. And for the past 3 years, we have been fighting to get a law passed in New York City that would ban the use of credit checks in the employment context. Does that sound like a good idea, given what we've heard? Yeah.
Bravo.
Well, you're clapping at just the very concept of it, but we should also clap because on May 6th, less than a week ago, Mayor de Blasio signed a bill into law, and it's the strongest such bill in the country, or law in the country. I'm so used to saying bill. It's the strongest such law in the country that actually makes it a violation of our human rights law. It makes it employment discrimination, a discriminatory practice to check somebody's credit in the employment context. And so I'm offering kind of a different angle on these broad issues, from thinking about the kind of abstraction of the legal sense, and Frank charted out saying, it would be problematic if we had one world or one space, I think you called it, that's legal, and another which is cyberspace or the internet. And I would say there's a whole other realm, which is our material lives, sort of how we exist socially, economically, politically, and so forth. So that's the sphere that I'm hoping to inject a little bit into our conversation. So we started thinking about these issues. The organization where I work is 20 years old, and for many years we were really focused on how Wall Street, the big banks, and other financial services providers, how what they did actually affected entire neighborhoods, the implications of financial practices for place, for community, and how it certain harmful financial practices actually perpetuated inequality, perpetuated poverty, perpetuated segregation. And so in the mid-2000s, where we had already for more than a decade been fighting against predatory mortgage lending practices, fighting against a kind of what we had seen as the emergence of a two-tiered system of financial services. One system, I don't know, it's the same system, right? It's not two different systems. You can think of it in different ways. It's the same system. One strain, one stratum serving whiter, more affluent neighborhoods, and a whole other shelf of financial services that targeted and continues to target poorer and communities of color. So we have this separate, unequal system, and as we saw this emerging, and again had been working for more than a decade on predatory mortgage lending, which was overwhelmingly concentrated in communities of color, as were the foreclosures, and then, this is before the meltdown, before the crash. As we came to understand that all of those sort of systemic inequities were being reflected in people's credit reports, and then the credit reports and the credit were being used to generate credit scores, and also to have being used in decisions not just around other forms of loans, but also in terms of employment and housing, insurance, really to affect people's economic opportunities in so many ways. That began to disturb us. And so we, started asking questions about why these companies should wield so much power over people's lives, and started to organize around this, and also started to educate people around this. Did you know that your credit report was being, used by employers, that you're signing something that's allowing them to effectively discriminate against you? And so I would say that our analysis very much aligns with what Frank describes in his book, which is that the, and a lot of people were surprised by this, kind of these algorithms that get used, there's numbers, there's calculations, there's figures, there's scores. They have this air of objectivity about them where people say, oh, well, it's a number. This is where you hit, this is where you landed based on all your mathematical data. Actually, these are numbers and information that effectively, what did you call it? Launder in? What is the language you use? All sorts of discrimination that get built in, that get embedded into this information and into these scores. I quote from the book that computerization may simply drive discrimination upstream. So what ostensibly seems like colorblind practices, as they're called, actually is a proxy in certainly the credit scoring and credit reporting realm, is a proxy for race, if it corresponds with anything. So let me fast forward really fast, because I'm going to fast forward fast. Okay, so let's think about these credit bureaus. We started getting groups together, and we said, look, this is really pretty pernicious what's going on. It's insidious, it's harmful, it's systemic, that you've got communities targeted for high-cost, harmful, discriminatory practices. Then the information gets reflected back in a credit report, and then a credit report gets used to decide people's job opportunity or housing opportunity or the cost of their insurance or how much down payment they're going to have to pay for utilities. So we decided to focus as our initial campaign on employment, because at this point it was past the recession, into the recession, and we thought this would be something really compelling for people. We could shine a light on these practices, and in exactly the time when people had been, so many people had lost their jobs, that the last thing we need, we kept saying, was, another way to exclude people from job opportunity, and that this was unfounded. So we did some quick research. I'm not going to go into sort of how intensely powerful the credit bureaus are. You can imagine, right? Right? And again, it became clear to us that there was little, and again, Frank talks about this in the book, there's very little in the law to prevent companies from selling the data, from selling your profiles. And what the credit bureaus have done, these big credit bureaus that are multinational, some of them, that have hundreds of millions of, they have data on hundreds of millions of people and so forth, that they're always looking for new markets, new ways to sell their data. And so employment credit checks is sort of a market niche that niche sounds too small, a whole market sector that they've created, trying to convince employers that you need this information. You need to know Alexis's credit history, because that's going to tell you what? If we know her history of paying her debts, what's it going to tell you? It's going to tell you her reliability. It's going to tell you if she's going to be likely to commit fraud or steal from you. It's also going to tell you, about her general job performance. And yet, even though the credit bureaus have convinced a huge percentage of employers that they need to buy this information, it's kind of like a rap sheet on prospective employees, they know full well that there is actually no correlation between information in your credit report and those other things they're telling you need it for. No demonstrated statistical or other evidence that connects your credit information with your likely job performance or likelihood or propensity to commit fraud or theft from your employer. It doesn't exist. They've said it, TransUnion officials said it under oath at a public hearing. We know of no such connection, but we're selling this stuff anyway. And in fact, 10%, the last numbers I saw, the industry Experian, to use them as an example, was getting 10% of its revenue from these, the employment credit check sector. All right, so we put together a coalition. Do I have 2 more minutes? We put together a coalition in New York City, and by last week, when the law passed, when the law was signed, we had 80 groups in this coalition. And it ranged from neighborhood-based, constituent-led base building groups to think tanks, policy think tanks. I would say if you're interested in this subject, I would start by reading Demos's excellent reports on employment credit checks. They've done some of the best work in the country on this. And they were certainly very important in the coalition, as was PIRG, and a lot of the student groups based at the city university campuses, some of the civil rights groups, labor organizations. The Central Labor Council got involved, but the Retail Workers Union, the Retail Action Project, and other groups were really important to this coalition. And we came together to get this law passed in 2012, and we had certain quick, I'll tell you very fast, some of the rationales. And very quickly, as we started to talk about this issue in community forums, through the media, individual New Yorkers started stepping forward. Almost all lower-income people, almost all people of color, but not exclusively. And it was interesting because a lot of them wanted to tell their story. They wanted it to be known what happened to them because they didn't want this to happen to other people. And I'll give you some quick examples. And a lot of them made video testimonials because they wanted, to tell their story in these quick snapshots. You can check them out on a website the coalition created called creditcatch22.org. It's actually Unite Here gave us their URL, creditcatch22.org, because they had a big campaign against TransUnion at one point. They gave it to us. It was great. But the New York campaign is at creditcatch22.org. And I'll just tell you a couple of quick examples. The first person to contact us was someone named Alfred. And he had been denied employment because he had been wiped out financially by uninsured medical expenses, and had to file for bankruptcy, had a great track record as actually a shoe salesman, and couldn't get work. And he couldn't understand what was going on, and eventually someone said, hey, you know what, it's that bankruptcy on your credit report. We had Gustavo come forward to tell his story. He had co-signed a loan for his sister, and she had had troubles, and then he couldn't get a job because it appeared on his credit report as a co-signer for his sister. We had Lisa, who went to one of the most notorious, horrible for-profit trade schools that had actually been closed down by the government, had this loan cloud hovering over her where, the loans were basically the whole reason that the school induced her to enroll in the first place, and she couldn't get a job. We had Emmett, who had a mistake on his credit report. He had the highest level national security clearance, was an Iraqi war veteran, and he couldn't get a job because of a mistake on his credit report that was from some mail order thing that had gone awry. We had Onika, a young woman who dropped out of college because of the crushing tuition expenses, who couldn't get she could get a retail job, but not at the level for which she was qualified. And so her wages were significantly diminished because of student loan issues. And it goes on and on and on. And in New York, as we tried to get this passed and people told their stories and people came out to really push for this, everybody understood at least the policymakers understood, the activists and advocates understood, and I think industry understood because they conceded that there's no connection between the two things. So as a matter of public policy, of course we should ban this because think about it. Some people would say, well, you get your interview to explain what's going on. Alexis goes to the job interview and says, well, you know, I had this, whatever. Why should somebody have to reveal private information at a job interview like, well, I got divorced. Oh, my mother died. You know, there are a lot of, some of the groups that got involved work with domestic violence survivors. Why should you have to talk about, you know, how your ex-husband stole your, you know, Social Security number and did all this identity theft? It goes on and on and on and on. So there's huge privacy issues. So it's not just about race discrimination, although that's huge. But also there's the errors in the credit reports. We, for years, were citing USPIRG study about 79% of credit reports having some error in them. Huh? 79, that means like most of us in the room. 25% have an error so material that it could affect us in the purchasing of credit. I'm finishing up. And so, you know, there's the errors. There's lots of different studies out there. There's many that you could cite. But there's also this asymmetry that you were hearing about from Frank, which is that the credit reporting agencies have all, or the credit bureaus have all the power. If you try to deal with an error in your credit report, anyone try to do that? Yeah. It is a maddening nightmare. It's extremely difficult, and the burden's on all of us to fix mistakes that these private corporations are making because it's their business model to assemble massive amounts of data and sell it and not really worry about the mistakes. So the big issue in the New York City campaign was that about carve-outs. Most states and other jurisdictions that have laws that ban employment credit checks have exemptions that eat their laws alive because they get swallowed up by the exemptions. You can't check someone's credit unless you have a bona fide purpose. You can't check someone's credit unless it's the financial services sector. Right? You can't check someone's credit unless you want to. No, I'm being facetious. But that's the gist. So we wanted to make sure our law was really airtight. I can talk about the carve-outs that we ended up with if anybody has any questions about them. The last thing I'll say is that there's a whole category of people, and I would say this is what's even more insidious than what you've already heard, is that you have to engage in this system to pass a credit check by an employer. Now, they're banned in New York City in less than 120 days now, but where it's permitted. Because if you have no credit history, that's also been grounds for people not getting jobs. And a young man named Ramon got denied a job at Goldman Sachs in the IT department because he had never taken out a loan. And the CFPB just last week put out a big report about how a huge strain of people in this country don't have any credit history. Largely, and if you're a Black or Latino person, the chances are even greater that you don't have any credit history. So it's really enmeshed, this idea that you have to engage in the system in order to avail yourself of basic opportunity.
Sarah knew that I've been fighting the credit bureau wars for 25 years, and so I was going to allow extra time to talk about us winning a battle against a Death Star. And it's a significant victory, and the New York Coalition of Civil Rights Consumers, student community, and other groups that she described really won a powerful victory against a powerful, self-appointed gatekeeper to your financial opportunities. So, by the way, our next panel, we will feature the Federal Trade Commission, which has been looking at the very small companies that are collecting and data mining and data brokering and don't think they're subject to the credit bureau laws. Hello, most of them are. And then the CFPB has authority to examine or look inside the black box of the biggest credit bureaus and FICO-like companies. So stay tuned for that. But first, I want to introduce again Alexis Goldstein of theother98.org, who has a lot more to say about these important issues as well.
So there's just a few points I want to try to hit on, and I'll try to be brief. But in reading Frank's book and hearing him talk, I sort of think a lot about what Sarah mentioned, this sort of two-tiered system and the hypocrisy. And I want to touch on one particular area where I feel like that's particularly flagrant. So for those of you that ride the metro, you may have seen these ads. I just saw it a week ago. It looks like a burglar. They're wearing a black mask, and they're at a computer. And it's an ad by the Financial Services Roundtable, and it says, please, urge Congress to pass cybersecurity laws. And it's sort of fear-mongering on this, on hackers, right? But the cybersecurity laws that the financial services industry has been trying to pass for a long time and have come into a lot of trouble doing it, the most recent incarnation of that was CISA, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, basically gives immunity to the nation's biggest banks if they overshare our personal information with the Department of Homeland Security or with the with the NSA. It also gives them carte blanche, according to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, to launch counterattacks on perceived cybersecurity threats. So if they perceive that somebody is hacking into them, they are lobbying through CISA to have immunity to launch a counterattack on that other person. The same lobbying groups that are trying to get this kind of immunity for oversharing our data is simultaneously, they failed, I should say, but they were in the past lobbying to prevent the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from adding what's called the narrative to the consumer complaint database. So if you run into problems with your credit card company or your financial services provider, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has a complaint database where you can log a complaint and you can tell your story, but those stories were previously private. And the big banks basically lobbied to keep that private. They set up a whole website called CFPB Rumors to try to say that this was like a government Yelp that was just going to allow people to slander the banks and make up stories about how that they were screwed over. Now, the good news is that they lost and that this will be a reality soon. You can submit complaints now and tick a box. You have to opt in to share your story. And I believe in a few months or sort of later this year, we'll be able to start to read them. But this is kind of some of this sort of two-tiered system, the hypocrisy that we see over and over again. I am going to protect my information. You cannot see my internal algorithms. You don't know what I'm doing with your data. But the minute you want to talk about me and share information about your experience working with me as a bank, no, that's not allowed. I also kind of want to hit on some of the points that Sarah mentioned about just how predatory some of this data collection can be. Some of you may be familiar, last week a horribly predatory for-profit school filed for bankruptcy, Corinthian Colleges. And these for-profit schools often relied on lead generators. And what those are basically people that will route consumers to you if you think that they may be candidates for these for-profit schools. So one of the creditors of Corinthian was this group called Neutron Interactive. And what Neutron Interactive and another group called EdSoup would do is set up these sort of fake websites that look like they're going to try to help you get food stamps, or they look like they're going to try to help you get Medicaid and walk you through that process. And you fill out a form and you put in your phone number, and 5 minutes later your phone rings and it's a recruiter from a for-profit college. And so they're basically very deliberately targeting people that are poor and trying to get help. And then they sell them this, dream of education. And then that leads to some of the things that Sarah was talking about. Like you mentioned, one of the people that came forward to tell their story, they go to these for-profit schools, they take out so much debt. A lot of times the debt is made fraudulently. We've talked to a lot of students. I'm part of a group called the Debt Collective that's been fighting for debt cancellation for Corinthian students. They had loans taken out without their without their knowledge, and they didn't even know about it. So then their credit gets ruined, and then they can't get a job. The other thing I want to mention, so I used to work on Wall Street, and I can tell you firsthand the data integrity, even on Wall Street, even on its own internal proprietary data, is horrible. So as one example, we had a problem with client data at several of the firms that I worked at. And the problem goes something like this. These firms are so big that there are so many different departments that interact with, say, UBS. So every different department creates an account in their own internal system for UBS. And so what that means is across all of Merrill Lynch or across all of Deutsche Bank or whatever firm, there's probably 100 different UBS accounts that are all to the same UBS. But nobody ever wants to prioritize fixing that problem because they want to spend money on the shiny new product. They want to spend money on refining their pricing algorithm. And so there's really bad data integrity even on the biggest banks. But then you think about data integrity for credit scores, or you think about data integrity for mortgages, or you think about data integrity for loan information. Like, just to go back to the Corinthian example briefly, we have students who can't get their enrollment agreements. They can't get their loan documents because these schools don't keep track of this information. So they're making all of this decision about all of this data that they're collecting about us, but then they can't give it back to us. Or they claim that they can't find it. Or, they never prioritize making the system easy to pull information when consumers want to get it back. And I just want to mention briefly, there's a group called Strike Debt that put together a whole book, basically, all about how to do things like contest your credit score, write letters, try to make sure that you have the right information, and NEDAP at the time, but the New Economy Project had a lot of resources that was very helpful in writing it. But I just want to shout out the URL. It's strikedebt.org/DROM. We call it the DROM, but it's the Debt Resisters Operations Manual. But there's just a whole chapter about here's how you can test things that are wrong in your credit score. And it's a really long chapter because it's a really confusing process. And we have, letters and things that people can write. But the other thing that this reminds me of is just the sort of regulatory arbitrage that Frank talked about, that is the sort of real risk of all of this, is that if we don't see into these black boxes, we don't know what's there, and we don't know how companies are going to use that to arbitrage the existing regulations. And this doesn't speak specifically to your point, but it made me think of the way that concentration of power on Wall Street also speaks to transparency issues when we just talk about things like over-the-counter trading versus market trading. So this is another hypocrisy thing. Wall Street has fought for years against exchange trading. They want to keep trades over the counter, which just means it's a deal between me and Sarah, since you picked on me in your section, and a piece of paper, right? No market, it doesn't post to any market. We don't know the trade occurred, and we have no knowledge of the volume of trades that are happening each day between me and Sarah and this piece of paper, and we're trading swaps, or we're trading whatever. And this benefits them greatly because then when advocates like us try to lobby and say, listen, we should really have more regulations on over-the-counter derivatives, the regulators say, well, give us some data. And we say, well, we can't give you data because it's not public. It's not on an exchange. And the only people who have the data are the banks. And of course, they will write all manner of white papers about their data, but it's this very one-sided conversation. So there's been some efforts to bring some transparency to this over-the-counter market. The CFTC has this thing called a swaps execution facility, but the banks are fighting it tooth and nail. And essentially the kinds of things they say is, no, you don't understand how this market works. This is really not what our clients want. And you even have a CFTC commissioner, Christopher Giancarlo, who used to come from what's called an interdealer broker. And an interdealer broker is an entity that only exists because these things are black boxes. So when me and Sarah want to trade with each other, if she's Goldman and I'm Morgan Stanley, I don't actually want Goldman to know what I want to trade. So we get a third party, we call up Ed or we call up Frank, and we say, Frank, I want to do a trade. You call Goldman and Bank of America and everyone else, and you tell them I want to do a trade, but don't tell them it's me. So Frank just sort of anonymizes the trade. That's what an interdealer broker is. So we now have a commissioner at the CFTC who came from an interdealer broker who is now telling us all the reasons we don't need transparency, we don't need more markets, when conveniently his former employer has basically an industry that benefits from this secrecy. So I know I'm getting a little bit sort of over here, but it makes my head explode because there's so much resistance to opening up these black boxes when it's us, when it's we want to know about my credit information. I want to be able to access what Google knows about me. I want to be able to have control over my Facebook data. But then when we just want to bring some products onto an exchange so other people can know what's going on, it's, oh, no, I'm sorry, it's very complicated, you don't understand. Here's all of the reasons we can't do that. And Frank, you mentioned something in your remarks about people are like, oh, well, just don't use Google or don't use Facebook. And if you haven't seen it, there's a really good talk. It's a few years old. It's by a guy who's in the security community, so he's got a pseudonym. His name is Moxie Marlinspike is the name he goes by. But he talks about this thing called the no network effect. And the no network effect is essentially, yes, we could all turn off our cell phones, but the world has changed and moved since cell phones were introduced. We used to say, meet me at this restaurant at 7 p.m. and I will be there. But now that we all have cell phones, we don't behave like that anymore. We say, call me after work, and we'll figure it out. Text me, email me. And so we can make a choice to not have a cell phone, but that's kind of like making a choice to not participate in society, because society has changed because of technology. And so we don't really have a choice. I mean, we can make a choice to go live, in the mountains, off the grid and all of that, but most people aren't going to make that choice. So we need to find an alternative solution to getting our data back, to opening up these black boxes, because otherwise they're just, the bad data integrity, the way that it's used in this predatory way is just going to continue to, I think, Sarah, you put it really well and I wrote it down. What did you say? Computerization may drive discrimination upstream. Oh, you said that. Oh, okay. So I'm quoting Sarah, quoting Frank. But I guess I'll say just one last thing, and I'm sure maybe the panel knows more about this than I do, but I think one specific example of this that I learned about at a consumer Fed conference is the way that auto insurers basically will charge poor people 40% more for auto insurance. So poor drivers are essentially subsidizing rich drivers. And they claim that they don't look at income because they're not allowed, and they claim that they don't look at race because they're not allowed, but you can figure it out. And they are figuring it out. They use, you can figure it out maybe based on where somebody lives, or you could look at their credit score, you can look at all of these other things. So we have all of these proxies for race, we have these proxies for income, but until we have transparency into the box, it's very hard to prove it. To charge poor drivers more than rich drivers? My understanding is rich drivers, they want to sell them more than just auto insurance. And they want to be able to cross-sell all manner of products. Whereas poor drivers, they know this is the only product I'm going to get out of them, so I need to charge them the most I possibly can because this is the only product that they will buy from me because they are mandated to buy it.
Plus, they would say if you have bad credit, you have a greater likelihood of filing claims, which I have not seen evidence of yet.
Yeah, and I saw, this is another stat from the conference. I don't remember who said it. It was an advocate from Maryland, but I guess they did polling, and 86% of people polled in Maryland don't believe that your auto insurance should depend on anything other than your driving record. And I personally would agree with that. So I sort of a little bit all over the place, but those are my thoughts.
I think that was great, and before I ask Frank to respond, the Consumer Federation of America is the group that did the auto insurance studies that Alexis is referring to. You can find their work at consumerfed.org. Frank, do you have any questions for the other panelists or any comments?
I'll be quick, and it's hard for me to express just how much I appreciate both the work that Sarah and Alexis have done. I mean, just incredible work to make our economy more equitable, and also it was a great honor to have their read of the book. And I just wanted to reinforce 2 points that they had made, and that there's so many that I could reinforce. But one is that in terms of, I think the core of Sarah's insight in terms of the importance of keeping these credit checks from keeping people from getting jobs was that you don't want people to get in a downward spiral, right? And we have to we can't be living in a society where one mistake, sometimes something that's not even your fault, can lead to an avalanche, a spiral of negative consequences. What's so interesting too is that what Sarah's presentation shows, I think, is the importance of actually talking to the people who are affected. If you take the time machine back about 10 years, when a lot of these things were just on the horizon, there's actually a University of Chicago legal scholar who wrote a few articles stating that the more big data that employers and others had about people, the less racial discrimination there would be. The rationale of the sort of ivory tower theory was that essentially employers who had some sort of racial bias, if they could disabuse themselves, if they could see that the person actually had good credit, then they'd say, oh, they're reliable, that'll overcome their bias, right? But what I started pointing out as of 2007, and what the activists and community advocates knew much better viscerally and through their own interactions was that never is the data simply given. Never is data simply a perfect reflection of how people act in the world, of their character, of their morals, of their judgments. It's always embedded in existing systems. So for example, if racial discrimination in the past led to people, to minorities having, say, 10 to 15% interest rates, well, of course, a group that has 10 to 15% interest rates is going to default at a higher rate than people that, say, have lower interest rates. And so built into the supposedly objective neutral data about defaults is the extant history of racial discrimination. And to get to the theoretical core of my book about its critique of data, so much of what's going on and the promises of the big data economy are that math and quantification can take us out of history and can lead to this sort of brave new world, not your new economy, but a brave new world of sort of objectivity, when in fact always the history is there. Always we have to be keeping track of that. I'd also say with respect to, Alexis made so many great points. I really want to hone in on her point about data integrity because of her experience in industry and her ability to say from the inside there are real problems. The more I talk to chief security officers, the more I talk to people who are working in the IT departments, in corporations elsewhere, I hear this over and over again about these problems of data integrity and how, as a matter of consumer protection, being able to demand your records and to get the accurate picture of what companies have on you, that's actually not just good for you, it's good as a discipline to their own data integrity. And I would say that, the US made a really big first step towards that, at least in the health sector, with respect to HIPAA and high tech. HIPAA in 1996, high tech, the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act of 2009, which updated HIPAA. These two acts say, not only do you have access to your medical record, you also, under high tech, have access to know who touched the medical record, who looked at it. You have, under high tech, rights to, consent to, and know about marketing uses of given data that is in your health record. And you have that level of ambition at the statutory level that has in turn unleashed innovation and responses from vendors to build that into a data infrastructure, right? And so I feel that that's one where, we have proof of concept in the health sector that we can take steps toward data integrity. We have that sort of proof of concept out there, and I think that's really important to sort of vindicate Alexis's point that making sure that the data is actually accurate and overcoming this one-way mirror effect, where essentially, we have a lot of corporations saying we get to know all we can about you, but you see very little about us. Overcoming that is really critical, I think, both to the scientific integrity, the business integrity, fair data practices, and just living in a society that we can really understand and be judged fairly and accurately. So I really appreciate these comments. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. I'll ask Mike to get the microphone if anybody from the audience has any questions. But first, do either of you have a reply or additional comment?
I guess one thing that I thought about is, and this is maybe more in the realm of the Supreme Court now, but it made me think of the disparate impact case that was heard and what the fallout of that may be, right? Because even when government agencies try to use data to prove discrimination, racial discrimination, using disparate impact, that has now been fought viciously by industry as well. And I suppose we'll have to await what the Supreme Court decides, but there's a very real opportunity that there's going to be a barrier. Again, to think back to the one-way mirror, right? It's so hard to prove racial discrimination even when we're talking about the black box, but the Supreme Court may be taking away to prove racial discrimination by striking down disparate impact theory. I don't know if folks are familiar with this. Yeah. That was just one thing that came to mind.
Yes, very worrisome. Yeah.
Somebody other hand up in the back, Mike.
Hi, I'm Sarah Parker from the Center for Financial Services Innovation. And so it'd be helpful if you could pinpoint where the main issue is, because we've talked about a lot of problems in the system. Is the problem the credit score model, and that, people are just a 550 and that might be accurate, that might not be accurate? And there's been a lot of initiatives recently to try and bring in alternative sources of data so that you're not just a 550, but there's more data about you that can actually give a fuller picture of your risk, which is what a credit score is ultimately supposed to give. Is that a good use of data? Is that still concerning use of data? Or is the issue that the credit score is being used for things way far afield from financial services like medicine or medical care or housing? I'm sure it's tempting to say, well, both, those are all problems, but just for the sake of argument and to, not be an echo chamber in here, where's the low-hanging fruit? What's the first thing that, we want to focus on and we need to focus on? Because you could talk about problems all day. Thank you.
I actually have I'll just take a first stab at it, which is I have a New York Times editorial from October where I tried to talk about initial steps toward making this system more transparent to consumers. So my concern is, in part, the escape of credit reports and credit scores outside their native their native environment in finance to these other fields. But I think, especially given the Dixon and Gelman report, one of the things that's really critical is that people be aware that some of these really sensitive scores or inferences about them have been made and that they be informed of them. So, I would give people the opportunity, just as we have a do not call list that gives people a chance to sort of sign up and say, do not call me, I would create registries whereby people could say, I want to know, have I been pegged as a fraud risk? Have I been pegged as bipolar? Have I been pegged as these certain sort of attributes that are now sort of floating around out there? Because clearly nobody can keep track of all that's going on among 4,000 data brokers. But what we can do is we can create obligations among those data brokers that once they start creating these sensitive inferences about individuals, that they report those to people so they have a chance to challenge them, annotate them, correct them, and know where they're being used. That, I think, is my bottom line. But yeah, thanks.
If I could add to that, if people are watching on the stream is at the top of the home page of the USPIRG Education Fund Center for Digital Democracy project on these issues. And one of our big concerns, if you scroll down, all of our reports and materials are on that same page. The big problem that I have is that even though the credit bureaus are regulated, strictly regulated, back in the day where the credit bureaus were the only animals out in the forest, they were regulated, okay? You had certain rights. There was a limited use of your information. They had the ability to sell it only for limited circumstances, limited purposes. But now there are many companies out there that are doing some of the same kind of data analytics. They're not necessarily covered as credit bureaus. You will hear from Jessica Rich of the FTC of the great work that they are doing to tell those companies, yes, you are, but there are many, many, many of them out there, and we're concerned that we have a law with strong fair information practices that is being heavily diluted. Second, we're concerned that it's all in a black box. And so part of the answer is to open up the black box. Part of the answer is to protect the integrity, extend regulation to other kinds of companies. Sarah.
So I have a sort of, it sounds like you want a quick answer to your question, like what's the nub of it? But I think that there's a few things that need to be said. One is that certainly when we're talking about the credit reporting, that's just one aspect of a bigger structural problem. So that's an example. And in the employment credit checks context, it's not a score being used. I want to clarify that. It's credit history. It's not a number. And, there are laws, like Ed was just saying, like the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and a lot of times people in New York, especially when we were first starting this campaign, said, well, don't you have a right under the Fair Credit Reporting Act to get an adverse action letter? And so aren't you protected so that if someone denies you a job based on your credit, you get a letter and you're told that? And that's part of the law, but that doesn't deal with the fact that there's discrimination and so forth. This is a discriminatory practice. And I would say that the problem for us is whether it's in the lending realm for which credit reports and credit scores were allegedly designed or ostensibly designed, or whether it's in these non-credit or non-financial realms, the credit information is a mirror. It's a reflection back of existing inequities in our economy, in our financial system. And so that plays out by race, by place, by gender, by national, by immigrant status, and so forth. So if that information is just, to the extent it's accurate, right, or inaccurate, because a lot of people, there might be a difference in who gets their mistakes corrected that corresponds to some of these, we'll call them protected classes or other categories. So to the extent to which credit reports assembled by these private companies tell us, are a mirror to existing inequality,
then to use those mirrors to make decisions about our economic, social, and other lives becomes a way to perpetuate that inequality. So there's no low-hanging fruit for us because we see it as deeply structural. And that's why we picked something that was low-hanging fruit, if you'll call it, which is a concrete campaign to elevate these issues, to help bring down a barrier to job opportunity, to allow people or help people or encourage people to engage in a conversation about all of this at the same time that we're changing the law. And the last thing I would say is, because it's systemic, doing these kinds of reforms are important, but they're not going to end the problem. We had a council member in New York who liked to say, Councilmember Levine from Washington Heights, who liked to say at press events, he had a really good line on it, which is that people think credit bureaus are a public agency, that they're a government agency. Or many people do, and they're anything but. These are these private companies that are collecting this information. And why should these companies have so much say over these really fundamental opportunities in our lives? And that it's really bizarre, this blending. And you should read Frank's book if you haven't, because he talks a lot about government and corporate, what do you call it, data valence? There's like a term you use.
Yeah, the data valence and data arbitrage between the two, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's, these are big, big, big problems that are only going to get worse, it sounds like. I'm terrified.
Well, and if I might jump in just really quickly to give you a couple more data points, maybe. When you were talking about that the person that tried to get the job at Goldman Sachs, he had no credit history and he couldn't get a job. I worked with a lot of people that had no credit history and had no trouble getting jobs. They were mostly British or Canadian, but they were able to get jobs. And one of them was a trader who made a lot of money and was very frustrated, actually, that he couldn't get a black Amex card because he had no credit history. And he was like, I'm a trader. I have so much money. Why can't I get a black Centurion Amex card? But it just sort of to your point that it just amplifies existing inequalities. Like having no credit history for the people that I worked with who were Canadian and British didn't seem to be an impediment to employment on Wall Street.
We have a question here from Joe.
Hi, Joe Valenti, Center for American Progress. I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about the problem being data kind of going off the rails or going out of context. What about the severe depth of data? And here's an example I can think of. So in the auto finance space, there's a lot of pushback to using credit. There's also this move to have tracking devices in one's vehicle. And I've always joked that, in some cases that's a good idea. If I ever get in a cab at LaGuardia, if my cab driver probably would have a tracker that's off the charts, but is responsibly taking me wherever it is that I need to go. It's just a function of traffic conditions or externalities. To what extent is it an issue of sort of depth and micro data as well?
Well, I have two responses to that. It's a wonderful question. And I think that one is, if we want to talk about concrete legislative responses to the Internet of Things. So for example, there are insurance companies that will say, as part of the bargain, we will give you a discounted rate if you allow us to put this event data recorder in your car at all times. I believe that in Scott Peppett's most recent article, and I can email this to you, he documented at least 4 states that restricted the ability of insurers to impose such invasive tracking technology. I think Virginia was one of them. And I think that is an area where we've got to be able to think beyond, say, the standard, static, somewhat stagnant economic models of a fair arm's-length transaction to consider what I think is reflected in that legislation, which is the power dynamics that are generated when, say, one industry can keep track of you at all times and build that into the business model. I also helped organize a panel at Patient Privacy Rights on wellness programs with exactly the same concern about the Fitbit, because now you don't have to worry about just your car having that on you. You could have a Fitbit on you. And it's only a matter of time before you see credit models based on, say, how many steps you walked per day or something, right? There's so many ways in which big data could be used. The other example that I would give is that there are now starter interrupt devices that can be part of these subprime lending arrangements. And I wrote a piece with Jathan Sadowski back in the fall about these things. You can just search for Pasquale and Sadowski for our piece, where we again worried about that, because now the rumor was that essentially someone had the starter interrupt device go off while they were on the freeway. That has not been validated yet, but nevertheless, we should be very suspicious of bargains where people are essentially allowing themselves to be sort of cut off remotely in this way, or at least there should be a lot of rules with respect to how that's implemented. I also just wanted to say one other point about, I've used a lot of examples from the health sector, and some people might say, well, health data is particularly sensitive. I think that, if you look at Peppett and Paul Ohm's project called the Discriminatory Inferences Project that they're now working on, there's evidence that a lot of people that are really the biggest boosters of big data say that everything predicts everything. For example, the way you drive predicts your credit score, and your credit score might predict your health in part, and your health might predict in part some other aspects about you. By its very nature, the way in which big data is being boosted for industry is inherently breaking down sectorial barriers between different types of data. So we can't allow industry to say, at one hand, as shareholders, we've got these big data methods whereby we're going to be able to tell people's finances from their health and their health from their finances and their residential history from something else. We can't allow them to say simultaneously that and then to also say, oh, well, you should just do sectoral regulation of different forms of data, right? They can't be speaking out of both sides of their mouth. They've got to either say the big data doesn't work, or if the big data does work the way that they're saying it works, that calls for a total rethink of sectoral privacy regulation. Thanks.
I want to thank the panel.